Let us now move to the second part, the second question. What does memory do? Now, here we're going to see that philosophers traditionally have had a very straightforward answer. And the answer seems pretty obvious. Well, memory remembers. That's what memory does. So here is a quote from George Frederick Stout, which was the author of this sort of influential textbook in the UK called the Manual of Psychology, which was kind of like the UK's response to William James' Principles of Psychology. Here is the first paragraph of the chapter on memory. Says Stout, memory is the revival of ideas. It is merely reproductive and does not involve transformation of what is revived in accordance with present conditions. Such revival, he says, requires the objects of past experiences to be reinstated in the order and the manner of their original occurrence. As we will see, pretty much nobody will believe that any of these statements are true of memory anymore. Nevertheless, for philosophers, this view of memory as being reproductive and as having to reinstate the ideas in the original occurrence and so on and so forth was pretty much the norm. And part of the reason for that is because many philosophers are sort of constrained by what it is known as the factivity constraint, the idea that remembering is factive. If X remembers that P, philosophers would say, then P must have been the case. Otherwise, it's not a case of remembering. It is similar to the case of knowledge. The verb to know is supposed to be factive because you cannot know things that are false. People in the 13th century didn't know that the earth was flat. They ignored that it was round. Likewise, you cannot remember something that is false. The thought is remembering is factive. You can only remember things that happen. As a result, imagination, which is not about things that happen, is a very different kind of faculty from memory, and thus to imagine is very different than to remember. And in addition to that, some philosophers went even as far as to say that when people seem to remember something or have the experience of remembering something, but that which they remember is false, is actually the result of their memory malfunctioning. So according to the philosophers' view of memory, what memory does is to remember. And remembering is actually reproductive. What do I mean by reproductive? The idea is basically something like this. You perceive something. Here we have this individual perceiving a red apple. So an individual perceives something, and during perception, that they create a perceptual representation of the thing that they see. Here is a perceptual representation of that red apple. That perceptual representation gets encoded after a process that's sometimes called consolidation, which gets fixed into some kind of memory trace, and presumably that memory trace is a little bit of fainter representation than the perceptual representation that they saw before. It is, of course, very different to see an apple than to remember the apple that I just saw when the apple is no longer present. But the thought is that it's the same representation, it's just a little bit less vivacious, it's a little bit fainter. Then that representation lays dormant somewhere in the storage of our memory. And then after a while, someone said like, hey, do you remember that red apple? And then that cue helps you to retrieve that faint representation. And according to the traditional view in philosophy, that faint representation could be the same representation, perhaps numerically identical to the original perceptual representation, the faint version of which was stored in your memory. So that is sort of one way of thinking about remembering as reproduction, right? But psychologists disagree with philosophers here. Psychologists might say, sure, what memory does is to remember, but remembering is not reproductive. Instead, what memory does is something more akin to reconstruction. This idea sometimes is traced back to a psychologist called Bartlett, who in 1932 wrote this very influential book called Remembering, where he argues that experiences are encoded and retrieved, but not as individual events, but actually as being related to a knowledge structure of previously encoded similar events. every act of encoding is an act of classifying within a framework of prior knowledge, and every act of retrieval is itself an act of re-encoding within a kind of with these conceptual structures that he called schemas. Other psychologists have been very influential with this view, as people like Dan Schachter, who have suggested that memory is reconstructive as opposed to reproductive. What memory is doing is not to bring back either a copy or perhaps even the exact identical representation as we saw before when talking about philosophers. But rather what it does is that at the time of retrieval, it puts pieces together, past information that might or might not have been acquired in the original occurrence. A fallout of this view is that remembering need not be factive. It might be possible that in the cobbling together of the experience that you're trying to retrieve from the past, what you put together is something that has some distortion to it, or that it is depicting a detail in the wrong way, and as a result, that which is brought to mind is not completely accurate. So remembering, according to this view, need not be factive. For the most part, it usually brings about memories that are true, but it could just as well bring a memory of an event that didn't happen. As a result, remembering then is contrary to knowledge, is not going to be factive, and so that one can remember that P even if P isn't the case. And part of what this view suggests too is that for psychologists, memory and imagination are not entirely different faculties. In fact, many of the processes by means of which memory reconstructs or pieces together an episode that purports to refer to the past, many of those same processes are actually operational when we try to imagine events that might or might not occur in our future or perhaps even in our past. And as a result of that, then false memories are not seen as the product of a malfunctioning system, but actually as a byproduct of a system that is functioning quite well. So this view of remembering as reconstruction stands in contrast to the view of remembering as reproduction that we just saw before. And it is a little bit trickier than the philosopher's view. So here's a way of thinking about it. One way of thinking about it is to think that what the memory system is in the business of trying to build a representation at the time of retrieval out of very scarce and noisy data. What is that noisy data? Well, you can go back to the original perception. So in the original perception, according to this view, when the individual is presented with an apple, there's all sorts of probabilistic processes that occur at the time of perception, right? So perception is not a passive phenomena in which information is impinging on our brain as if our brain was a tabula rasa. No, actually perception is a very complex interactive process in which the brain is trying to predict what it is more likely that the information is trying to give us, right? So perception is already a very probabilistic process. In addition to that, not everything that is perceived is going to be encoded in memory. And not everything that gets encoded in memory is actually going to be stored. Okay? So what we're seeing here is already a process, an informational process from perception to consolidation to storage in which there is an enormous amount of informational loss. Okay? In fact, there is some question as to exactly what is that which gets stored. For some people, what gets stored is something like a very drafty representation of the original perception. Some might even go and say that there is no such representation, and that instead what gets stored is simply an index that has something like instructions to how to go about reconstructing the original perception at the time of retrieval. But in any case, what it does seems to be clear is that there is a lot of informational loss from perception to consolidation to storage. What happens at the time of retrieval is that you get a cue. So suppose that someone said like, hey, do you remember that red apple that you just saw a week ago or whatever? And then in trying to do so, your memory system said like, all right, I'm getting this noisy and very scattered signal. How can I reconstruct the best possible representation of what must have happened in the past in order for this to be a memory of that event? So the system, as it were, is trying to solve what I would call a reverse inference problem. Given this signal that I get, that it is very gappy, what must have been its cause? And to do so, what it does is that it employs the best probabilistic strategies to fill those gaps with what it is more likely that could have happened in the past. So this reconstruction is highly constrained by probabilistic assignments to gapping information. And most of the time, and this is the beauty of it, is that it really does coincide with what happened in the past. But it might be possible that at times it doesn't. The important point is that these reconstructive processes are no different for many instances of false memories as they are for most, if not all, of our instances of true memories. So the view at the end is that we get a representation that in terms of content is not that terribly dissimilar from the original encoded representation, but the processes by means of which you get that representation at retrieval are very different from those suggested by the philosopher. Because the philosopher suggests that what happens is simply that there is a reproduction from the past. What the psychologist is going to suggest is not, that there occurs is this very more complex reconstruction that brings about something like a very similar result. Do we have any empirical evidence to the effect that the system of reconstruction, of our memory reconstruction, is sensitive to these background conditions and background knowledge and so forth? We actually do have quite a bit of it, and one way in which I like to point out some of this evidence is by reflecting on this very well-known but now pretty old experiment conducted by Elizabeth Loftus and collaborators in 1978. What this experiment shows is, is this car, which turns out it was a red Datsun, failing to stop in front of a traffic sign. Now, half of the participants saw the red Datsun failing to stop in front of a stop sign, and the other half saw the red Datsun failing to stop at a yield sign. Now, importantly, half of the participants that saw the car failing to stop in front of a stop sign got a questionnaire that included a tricky question. So, like, do you remember the red Datsun failing to stop in front of a yield sign? Again, half of the participants who saw the stop sign received the misinformation question of a yield sign, and half of the participants that saw the yield sign got the misinformation question about the stop sign. And the reason why they were doing that is because they wanted to show that this didn't have to do with traffic sign, but rather had to do with just misinformation. And what is very interesting is that, sure enough, if you have seen the stop sign, there was a substantial amount of people that falsely recall having seen the red Datsun failing to stop at a yield sign and vice versa. But at this point, I was very curious. This was years ago when I was in grad school. I was very curious. I said, well, both traffic signs, the stop sign and the yield sign, are typical that we can see in corners like this. And it turns out that many of our false memories have this sort of air of plausibility to them. They're just driven, they're schema consistent, and so forth. What would happen, right? What would happen if we conduct this study again, but now we're going to have a traffic sign that is very unlikely that you will see, like a kangaroo crossing, which are definitely not common in North Carolina. So what would have happened if we show in a third condition, a red Datsun failing to stop at the kangaroo sign? And what happens, as many of you hopefully will have think by now, is that people are less likely to false alarm to having seen the kangaroo crossing relative to the other two. And in fact, you can see here in the right side of the screen the distribution of errors. Almost no one false alarmed to having seen a kangaroo when the kangaroo crossing was the misinformation question relative to the yield sign or the stop sign. And the answer and the reason for that is that it is pretty clear that our background knowledge influences the way in which we false alarm to information or misinformation. Here's one of my favorite studies showing how background information can influence your memory later on. This is a study conducted by Alan Castell and collaborators in 2007. In this study, what Alan Castell did is that it divided participants into individuals that knew a whole lot about American football and individuals like me that know nothing whatsoever about American football. Now, they exposed participants to this very well-known false memory paradigm called the DRM paradigm, in which they basically show words that are semantically associated, such as bed, pillow, dream, and so forth. And then they give them a word that is semantically associated, like sleep. Most people falsely remember having seen sleep in the list because the word sleep, even though it wasn't in the list, was semantically associated. But here is the kicker in this study. This study, what participants needed to do was basically to read a bunch of words that were the names of animals. Now, unbeknownst to them, the animals sometimes were also grouped according to NFL teams, to teams that were professional football teams. Now, if you didn't know anything whatsoever about American football teams, you wouldn't have noticed the association of those teams because they were associated due to being football teams. And as a result, that semantic association wouldn't have affected the way in which you encoded that information or retrieved it later on. And what they show is that individuals that are experts in American football teams remember more animal words than those that were not expert in American football teams. But they also had more false alarms, that is to say, they also had more false memories about words that they didn't see in the list relative to those that were not experts in American football teams. And they compared this with body parts in which everyone was equally an expert. So here we see that expertise can boost your memory, but also it can generate way more false alarms than lack of expertise. Now, evidence to the fact that some false memories and true memories share computational processes comes from research in what it is sometimes known as the cognitive neuroscience of constructive memory. We see this line from this very famous paper from Dan Schachter and John Addis in 2007, where they say, quote, that related or gist-based false recognition depends on many of the same neural processes as true recognition and shares relatively little in common with unrelated false recognition. So what it looks like is that maybe there is a reason as to why some kinds of false memory and true memories are dependent on similar brain regions. And the reason, I surmise, and many of these individuals working on this area of research suggest, is because our episodic memory is part of a larger system that generates a particular kind of episodic simulation. So let's talk a little bit about that. So, as we have seen just before, deficits in the mediotemporal lobe typically bring about deficits in autobiographical episodic memory. So HM, for instance, had difficulty in coding and remembering particular episodes that happened to him in the past. But another thing that is very interesting is that individuals that have difficulty remembering the past also have very severe difficulty imagining themselves in the future. This initial observation was documented by also Enda Tulving, showing that KC had difficulty envisioning himself in the future, in possible future events that could happen to him, as well as being able to remember events that happened to him in the past. This observation was later on corroborated by Stan Klein and colleagues in 2002, and as you can see, this other paper, Demis Hassabis and collaborators in 2007, where they show, and you can see on the right side of the screen, that individuals with mediotemporal lobe amnesia have real hard time, that's the patient's bar, had real hard time imagining possible events relative to controls. We also see that individuals with depression that have shown volumetric reductions in the hippocampus have not only difficulties remembering the past, but also imagining personal futures, as well as individuals with schizophrenia that also have volumetric reductions in the hippocampus. Similarly has been shown with healthy individuals that the phenomenology of episodic future thought and episodic memories is very similar and different, and similar manipulations that alter episodic memories can also alter episodic future thinking. And of course, there's research coming from neuroimaging showing this very remarkable overlap in brain regions that are involved in thinking about the past and thinking about the personal future. Back then, when these results came out, many of those neuroscientists sort of explained them in terms of saying that episodic memory and episodic future thinking are part of a unified system for, they called it, mental time traveling, the capacity to mentally travel back in time and mentally project ourselves forward onto the future. But remember, we are neurophilosophers here, so we can see that already that there seems to be a possible asymmetry in thinking about a system like this. Because on the one hand, we as philosophers are told that memory is what happened in the past. In other words, so when we think about memory, we only think about one way in which the past could have occurred. But when we think about the future, we think about sort of a cone of possibilities, many ways in which personal future could have been. So a question that that has guided a lot of my research is, can we think about the involvement of episodic memory not only about possible ways in which the future might occur, but also possible ways in which the past could have occurred but didn't? And I called, many years ago, I called this sort of more symmetric view of this cognitive system the episodic hypothetical thinking system. And I saw people working in mental simulations about possible futures as working on this right side of the cone of light, the episodic future thinking right. And a lot of my work has been on episodic counterfactual thinking and thinking about alternative ways in which past personal events could have occurred but didn't. And what I have shown in a lot of the work coming from my lab is that the very same regions that are engaged in thinking about the past and thinking about personal future are also engaged when we think about alternative ways in which past events could have occurred. But they are also to be distinguished from other kinds of counterfactuals that do not involve self-projection. And if anyone is interested in digging a little bit more about this line of research, the recent review paper came out a couple of years ago, is shown here in the slides. So, to sum up, a traditional view of thinking what memory does is to say that what memory does is to remember. And one might be tempted to think, along with many philosophers in the past, that to remember is simply to reproduce a past perception that was passively accepted by our perception at the time of retrieval. But it looks as though a more complex answer, and perhaps a more accurate answer, is to think of memory as a process of reconstruction, in which what the memory system is trying to do is to solve something like an inverse problem. Given this gappy and noisy information that I am getting at the time of retrieval, what could be the best possible content that will render this a memory of something that occurred in the past? And that process of reconstruction might look as though, from the inside, as if it was a reproduction from something that occurred in the past, but in reality it's a complex computation that involves the probabilistic assignment of information that depends on a number of things, including background knowledge and conditions of recall. Why would we have a memory system that reconstructs as opposed to reproduce? Well, one possibility is because that memory system is actually part of a much larger system or a much larger operation that is in charge not only of storing exact information of what happened in the past, but actually generating possible mental simulations of what might occur in the future or what might have occurred in the past. So episodic memory is seen as a particular operation of a much larger system that is in charge of episodically simulating possibilities.